We're finally moving on to the question of who Totoro is. Here is Totoro! Well, this is a scene where he meets Satsuki for the first time. When the movie was first released, Totoro was announced to be 2 meters tall and 1,302 years old. But there are different theories. The most popular saying is that the primordial forest in the last scene of Princess Mononoke dies in the end, but later revives. No, there's a character called Kodama. This teeny tiny character is sitting surrounded by young trees and shaking his head, and he's the only survivor in the scene. Miyazaki later said, "This is Totoro." If this is true, because Princess Mononoke takes place around the end of the Muromachi period, which is 1400s, well, it's said to take place 100 years before the arrival of the Gons, so it should be 500 to 600 years old, like around 1450, which makes Totoro's age 500 to 600 years old. But there's a background story to this setting according to Miyazaki. A genius animator called Makiko Futaki was in charge of this scene. She was such an amazing animator. Unfortunately, she passed away, but she said to Miyazaki, "Can we say that Kodama is Totoro?" She was drawing the last scene herself, and when it came to the scene where there are only trees, she said to Miyazaki, "How about we add just one Kodama in the scene?" Then Miyazaki said, "Oh, that's a good idea, let's do that." That's how one Kodama appears in the last scene. Futaki said, "I have been working on Princess Mononoke as an animator all this time, and the current ending is too much to bear. We always end up criticizing as human beings by questioning, why do we always fail? It's too much to take. I want hope in the end, so why not add Kodama and say it's Totoro?" And Miyazaki said, "Great, let's do that." Therefore, it's not his original idea, he just accepted someone else's. So the official setting of My Neighbor Totoro says he's 1,302 to 3 years old, while another theory written in various articles says that it's grown-up version of Kodama, but it's just been added afterwards. He's actually a lot older. In an interview with Miyazaki, it's written that Totoro has lived longer than 3,000 years. That's obviously way older than 1,302 years old or 500 to 600 years old, as the latest scene of Princess Mononoke indicates. This is something about Totoro that children don't need to know about. This kind of stuff is for adults, and children must fall asleep halfway through the story if they hear it. Once they become adults, they can appreciate it. There's a series called Ghibli's Textbook, published by Bungei Shunju, which is an official publication by Ghibli. And in one volume of the series titled The Wind Rises, a Ghibli producer Toshio Suzuki said, "Miya-san, as in Miyazaki, Miya-san had such a delusion about Totoro. Once there were many Totoro tribes in this world, they were destroyed by fighting mankind. But the survivors appeared in many different eras. Mononoke or supernatural beings in the Middle Ages, ghosts in the Edo period, and now Totoro. Totoro has such a history. It's not just a cute creature. It can also be fearful." This is such a shocking remark. Normal audience watching the movie may think that Totoro disappeared from Japan because the beautiful nature during the late 1950s to 60s has been lost from Japan. But that's not the reason. It was because they were destroyed by fighting humans. And this is the original plot of My Neighbor Totoro, which Miyazaki came up with. Then what was that fight all about? Before discussing that, let's talk about another feature of Totoro. This is the scene where Mei first sees Totoro. When she comes down from the hole in a tree, she finds this huge creature, but then there is also something strange in the picture. Almost everything in this place where Totoro inhabits is natural, but these are the only artificial things. So what are they? I will show you a close-up shot later, but these are pottery from the Jomon period, and he actually uses them. Totoro is such a strange creature. He doesn't use any tools, but he has Jomon pottery for some reason. Besides this one, there are more mysteries about Totoro. For example, in the scene where Satsuki meets Totoro for the first time, he just stands there still as if it's daily routine. He rather looks bored. It's because Totoro uses this bus every day. Cat bus is a regular bus which always arrives at that time. That's why Totoro seems bored. Miyazaki explained the reason for this. He wanted Totoro to behave like an ordinary old man waiting for a bus every day at the same time at a bus stop. That's why he intentionally wrote on the storyboard, "This old man." That's how normal it is for Totoro to be there, that he uses that bus every day. In other words, it's not the first time for Satsuki to see Totoro or to meet him, but they just couldn't see each other at all. Satsuki must have passed by him around this bus stop almost every day, but they have been invisible to each other. Miyazaki wrote a cautionary note very carefully and repeatedly at the drawing stage. It said, "Please make Totoro's eyes out of focus. For Totoro's facial expressions, please make sure that they do not meet Satsuki and Mei in the eyes. He has to look like he's not thinking about anything. People shouldn't be able to read his mind." He kept making these requests, and at the end Miyazaki was like, me, I'll do them," which was what Tezuka always did, and volunteered to do majority of Totoro's drawings. But what's interesting was that he was not interested in Satsuki. So speaking of being invisible to humans, this one story which I personally think is scary. So there might only be a tiny bit of scary element in it, but there was one episode in this TV program that I watched that was so scary, and it was about psychic photos. They brought them to an exorcist. Then they said, "Oh, this is a ghost of so-and-so, this and that." When they saw this one photo, as soon as they took a glance at it, they laid it face down. Then in a hurry, they wrapped it with I forgot paper or something, then said, "There's something in this picture that no one should see." Then they said, "Dedicate it to a shrine nearby and ask them to deal with it. Just don't look at it ever again." The reporters asked, "What shouldn't be seen?" Then the exorcist hesitantly said, "It's a god." This is my favorite or scary story because it shows the difference between Shinto gods and Western gods. In the West, if anyone can see a god, it's a miracle, and they would be seen as a prophet. Gods are invisible, so being able to see them is good news. However, Shinto gods, or the gods of those religions before they came Shinto originally, cannot be seen. And once they are, they need to be worshipped because otherwise they would haunt people. This is what's interesting about Japanese gods. This is a real and common thing in countryside. There are places where those grandfathers and grandmothers who grew up in the forest never go into. They would never go in there and say if they go, they feel the chill. It's different from the area in the forest where people go hiking and relax. It's like a mixed forest where people inhabit. It's deeper inside. It's either in the primeval forests or the sacred shrine forests. Somewhere, people don't feel so comfortable living or feel creepy by going there because it's a place where people feel a chill. They don't go near there. That's why there's no mountain path to those places. You know how people feel purified or energized by going to those spiritual places? That's just a lie. You don't get any energy. If there is a place where true energies flow out, where there is a real power, even local people never go there. There are no roads, no shrines, and no archaeological sites because no one goes there. There's always a place deep in the mountains that gives people a bad feeling, and those who are well aware of the place never approach there. Japanese people have called such places as mountain sanctuaries. Totoro lives in such a place. Of course, there's a lie towards the kids' audience of My Neighbor Totoro where the characters see a big camphor tree and say, "Wow, what a nice tree. Awesome, Daddy decided to move in here when I saw this tree. But if it was really nice, everybody would live there." In reality, Totoro lives in a place where you have a bad feeling, so you don't go near it. That's how the forest is protected. So what is he? Or who are Totoros really? Totoros are ancient gods, ancient Japanese gods. At the same time, they're indigenous people who have lived in Japan way before humans did. They have coexisted well with humans during the Jomon period, and that's why you see there are some Jomon pottery pieces in Totoro's house. They aren't just there, but neatly placed in the room, and the straw row patterns are drawn in the fine details. What this is that, well, let me show you one more. This is an exciting scene here. Totoro takes out this huge top made of iron from somewhere that looks like a pocket. aircraft. He launches it forcefully, gets on it, and flies into the sky. It's a dramatic scene, but the spinning top is not a tool for flying. According to the setting, he received it from the boy who was playing with it during the Edo period. In an interview, Miyazaki said that Totoro learned how to make Jomon pottery from the Jomon people. He actually learned and made one for himself, that pottery we saw. He also imitated a boy from the Edo period spinning tops. Miyazaki said Totoro has lived for 3,000 years. He thinks he's learned them only recently. Like the top, the umbrella he receives from Satsuki is just a toy. Totoro doesn't care about the original purpose of those tools. To him, everything is either a toy or a musical instrument. Miyazaki then said, maybe Kanta's grandmother has met Totoro, maybe when she was walking outside crying after being scolded by her parents. Perhaps Totoro thinks of her grandmother and Mei as the same girl. Miyazaki created a setting that those people may have played with Totoro when they were very young. However, only Jomon pottery is used correctly, unlike the umbrella or the spinning top. By the way, it looks like he flies by riding the spinning top, but no, Totoro can fly without any tools. It's just fun to spin a top and ride it when he flies. So there's no meaning to it. It's just like how he uses umbrella as a tool for prayer. He does something that has nothing to do with the original usage of those tools. To summarize, Totoro's are forest gods who have lived in Japan for more than 3,000 years. They could coexist with people from the Jomon era, but then later got into a war with humans and were destroyed. The Totoro that comes out in the movie is the last survivor, so why did they die out? Well, let's talk about why. Now, look here. This is the Japanese islands, or should I say Japanese peninsula 20,000 years ago. This bow-shaped part that sticks out from the continent is Japan before the Jomon period, which is 20,000 years ago. There's no Sea of Japan yet, but only a huge lake. Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku are all combined and connected to Korean peninsula, except there is a river flowing in between. What will become a strait is still just a large river at this point. Hokkaido and Siberia are connected completely. This was 20,000 years ago. The Seto Inland Sea isn't there yet either. This is the Japanese peninsula and it's super large. Because of this vast peninsula, we could have maintained laurel forests and deciduous broad-leaved forests. In other words, the reason why ancient Japan was a large forest was because it was a huge peninsula 20,000 years ago. Today's Japanese islands cannot sustain such huge forests, since there was not even the Seto Inland Sea of Japan yet, but a huge piece of land which could grow forests of the scale that allowed these gods to exist. The sizes of Japan today and 20,000 years ago are too different. Because it was a huge land that could hold huge forests, the gods of dogs and the wild boar gods who appear in Princess Mononoke could exist there. Do you remember Okoto, the leader of the wild boar god? He came from the west, Kyushu region. But in Princess Mononoke, Okoto laments for the current situation. He commented, "Look at my tribe. We grow small and we grow stupid." In reality, Okoto and his tribe were not destroyed by losing a war against humans. The reason why they were destroyed was... I have to talk about this. This is the difference between the average temperature from 10,000 years ago until today. But you see how the average temperature was lower by 5 degrees Celsius back then. But at around the beginning of the Jomon period, the temperature went up to 7 to 8 degrees, which would be around 2 degrees higher than now. So what happened 10,000 years ago because of this change? Seawater shrinks if it's cold and expands if it's hot. In other words, the reason why sea level rises when the earth becomes warm is not because the ice melts, but the sea itself slightly expands due to the increase of the temperature. So what it means for the earth to be 5 degrees colder than now was that the sea level went down. So the Japanese islands, well, in this case, the whole Japanese peninsula rose up from the sea. But as you can see on the chart, 7,000 years ago, the temperature boosted all the way up to 7 degrees. It said that as a result, the sea level was increased by 100 meters. In other words, a great part of Japanese land went underwater a long time ago. As a result, the Seto Inland Sea was formed. While most of the huge forests in Japan that nurture the ancient Japanese gods, such as the Totoro tribe or wild boar god, sank into the sea. Most or the pretty much half of the land has submerged into the sea, and Kinki Mythology region got flooded. We often say, oh, this area used to be underwater, but that's due to the rising temperatures between 6 to 7,000 years ago. By the way, have you ever heard of Kikai caldera? We know the specific year, 7,300 years ago. It's a volcano off the coast of Kagoshima Prefecture in Kyushu region. It's been said that magma has accumulated there once again, so it's dangerous. Anyway, there was a huge eruption of Kikai caldera 7,300 years ago. This was such a great eruption that would have destroyed the entire human race if it were to happen again. It's said that it wiped out the whole civilization of the early Jomon period. Well, I'll talk more about this when I discuss Princess Mononoke. But the reason why Okoto and the wild boar gods became smaller and smaller as they moved up from the west is because there was a large eruption of Kikai caldera. It's like the second impact of Evangelion. As a result, Kyushu became no longer habitable. And just like how the early Jomon civilization was wiped out, Okoto's tribe moved towards the east all at once. At the same time, the amount of sea level rose, and finally a strait was formed between Korea and Japan. As a result, the Sea of Japan was also formed, where the warm ocean current streamed into. Mamiya or Tottori Strait was formed in the north, and cold water entered in from Siberia, which created the warm current. As a result, there were now heavy snowfalls along the Sea of Japan, where the snow piled up high. Then Japan became warm for the first time in history, surrounded by more seas, and rice farming started. As the rice was mass-produced, what happened was forests were cleared and became rice fields. The population showed rapid increase. As a result, the wild boar gods were destroyed by humans. The gods in Princess Mononoke were not destroyed as a result of forests being cut down or burned. In the first place, there were magnificent forests in Japan 10 to 20,000 years ago because Japan used to be a peninsula. However, the sea level rose by about 100 meters and the temperature rose by 7 degrees, and the forests were lost. At the same time, a huge explosion occurred in Kikai caldera, and from the Kyushu region to perhaps the Chugoku region became uninhabitable. As a result, people moved toward the east, but that was the time that Yayoi people came from China and the Korean peninsula and began to grow rice and cut down the forest at a furious speed. That's why wild boar gods hate iron and fire. They hate iron because the Yayoi people who make rice use iron. At the same time, they hate fire because it reminds them of Kikai caldera. Well, that's basic setting of Princess Mononoke, and more importantly, this is the story of Totoro's ancestors. The ancient gods of Princess Mononoke originally flourished on the earth 20,000 years ago, kind of like Cthulhu. They were the indigenous people and humans were outsiders, but they lost their homes due to the volcano eruption of Kikai caldera and the rising of the sea level 6,000 years ago. I'll go in depth about this when I discuss Princess Mononoke. But these Jomon people were good friends with the Totoro tribe. They were engaged in agriculture but in a small scale. However, the agriculture of the Yayoi people was in a large scale. They cut down the ancient forests to make fuels and to convert them into rice fields. As I said earlier, these ancient forests eventually turned into somewhere easily accessible by humans. The deep forests that had once been filled with the ancient sawtooth oaks and beeches were quickly lost during the Jomon period and became easy to use copses. So what we are seeing right now isn't really natural. We go camping in the mountains and feel the nature, but that nature is a result of humans remodeling the entire Japanese islands through agriculture. 99% of them are not primeval forests anymore. Only the forests created by humans through agriculture remain today. And the ancestors of Totoro, the ancient gods, can't live in this kind of forest. They were really born out of the primordial forests. So the result of what Okoto described as smaller and stupid is that Totoro, who comes out in the movie, he's only 2 meters tall and can't speak a human language even though he's a god. So So this is the actual outcome of how the ancient gods ends up after Okoto says, "We will die out soon. We're growing smaller and we're growing stupid." But instead, they learn to coexist with humans. Specifically, they started eating acorns and living quietly in sacred shrine forests near the outskirts of the countryside, and learned to make pottery from the Jomon people and spinning tops from children in the Edo period. So they learned to live in the shadows. That's why I assume that as a result of the Great War 700 years ago, which I call the Great Mononoke War, the descendants of the ones who were defeated still live quietly all over Japan, like Totoro in Tokorozawa City. So he's kind of like American Indians who were exterminated by Westerners. He's similar to that kind of indigenous people who lives hiding from the Yayoi people like us who grow rice. So once again, let me quote producer Suzuki's words in the volume of Ghibli's textbook, The Wind Rises. He said, "Miyazaki-san and I originally had this delusion about Totoro. There were many Totoro tribes in this world. They were destroyed after fighting humanity, but survivors appear in various times, such as Mononoke in the Middle Ages, Ghost in the Edo period, and now Totoro. So Totoro carries such a history on his shoulder. It's not just a cute creature, it also contains fear." Miyazaki set this backstory, but kept it hidden for the movie that was targeted for children. But that was not enough for him, so after 10 years, he couldn't bear it anymore, and that's how he ended up making Princess Mononoke. So it's kind of opposite of Star Wars, or should I say it's the same. He first depicted how the story ends, and then he depicted why things happened the way they happened. So My Neighbor Totoro is actually the sequel of Princess Mononoke. And Miyazaki was really going to stop at My Neighbor Totoro, but he couldn't help. Then why couldn't he? Well, many texts have written about how Miyazaki became more and more obsessed with researching such fields as agriculture during the Jomon period, culture theory and lore of forest, and so on. That's why he couldn't help telling a story about them. He made Princess Mononoke because he couldn't hide the history which he had in My Neighbor Totoro. Actually, My Neighbor Totoro is related to another work. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind depicts an era where humans live quietly hiding from giant gods. Then Princess Mononoke depicts humans destroying giant gods. And My Neighbor Totoro depicts a relationship between human children and a god whose ancestors were once gigantic but has become incomparably small as mankind prospered. So in fact, Miyazaki's works create an interconnected cycle, and so are these three works. But why couldn't Miyazaki stop after making My Neighbor Totoro? Why did he need to give it prequels? Originally, Miyazaki said that Studio Ghibli would be dissolved after My Neighbor Totoro was completed. He thought it was natural for a studio to dissolve after making three works because that's how many one studio could make. That's why he said that Studio Ghibli could dissolve after making My Neighbor Totoro. However, a life-shaking incident for Miyazaki happened at the same time as the release of My Neighbor Totoro, which was the release of Grave of the Fireflies that came out with Totoro. Thanks to this, Miyazaki had to take back his word that he had done everything he wanted to do. He'd really said, "After I'm done with My Neighbor Totoro, there's nothing more that I wanted to depict, so I will go back to animator position." But Grave of the Firefly came out and it was a nightmare and it traumatized Miyazaki, and as a result, Miyazaki continued to make more animes.